Most people think their biggest mistakes come from bad information. They usually come from a nervous system that was too noisy to read the situation correctly. That moment you walk into a room and feel something is off before anyone speaks. That isn't intuition or energy. It's your brain running rapid pattern detection on tone shifts, facial tension, timing, posture. Thousands of signals compressed into one internal signal. The problem is signal quality. When your nervous system is overloaded, deadlines, pressure, financial stress, the brain switches from accuracy to speed. It scans for threats, shortcuts decisions, and compresses nuance. That's when people buy too early, sell too late, ignore red flags in partnerships, or hesitate on opportunities they were actually ready for. From the outside, it looks like a strategy problem. Internally, it's a regulation problem. The people who seem unusually good at timing decisions, investors, leaders, negotiators, aren't sensing more than you are. Their systems are simply quieter, and a quieter system detects patterns earlier. In this video, I'll show you 3 signs. Your nervous system is distorting the signals you rely on for decisions, and one simple adjustment that restores signal clarity under pressure. Most days start the same way. You open your messages. A few emails need quick replies. A small problem from yesterday still needs fixing. Someone is waiting for confirmation on a task. None of it feels heavy. In fact, it feels responsible. You respond to the message. You solve the small issue. You adjust the schedule for the afternoon. A few minutes later, something else appears. Another message, another small decision, another quick fix. The day starts moving, and from the outside, everything looks productive. You're active, you're responsive. Things are getting done, but somewhere in the background, a different kind of decision is sitting quietly. A larger one. Maybe it's a strategic change, a financial move, a conversation you've been meaning to have, a risk you've been considering for weeks, nothing urgent, nothing broken. So it waits. And the day continues, filling itself with smaller tasks. Another email, another quick adjustment, another short meeting. Each one takes only a few minutes. Individually, they're harmless. But something subtle begins to happen. The day becomes full before the important decision ever gets real attention. Not because you avoided it intentionally, simply because everything else felt easier to finish first. And when the afternoon arrives, the decision still feels slightly heavy. Not impossible, just not the easiest thing to deal with right now, so it moves to tomorrow, which feels reasonable. Tomorrow, you'll have more time, more clarity, less noise, but the next day often starts the same way. Messages waiting, small problems already moving. The system rewards responsiveness. Quick decisions feel good because they remove pressure immediately, and before long, the day feels productive again. But the larger decision is still sitting in the background, unresolved. At first, this doesn't seem like a problem. Work is moving, things are stable, but occasionally something curious happens. An opportunity appears, and the timing feels slightly off, or a situation changes just enough that the decision becomes harder than it was before. Nothing dramatic, just a small shift, the kind most people barely notice, because on the surface, everything still looks like progress. And that's usually the moment when a pattern has already started, a pattern most people can't see yet, not because the signals aren't there, but because the system reading them is already busy doing something else. After a while, the routine becomes familiar. You start the day by clearing messages, a few quick replies, a couple of small adjustments. Someone needs a decision that only takes a minute. You handle it. Then another small situation appears, a short call, a quick review, something simple to fix. None of it feels overwhelming. In fact, it feels like progress. The day moves forward in small, manageable pieces. But in between those pieces, subtle moments begin to appear. A pause during a conversation that feels slightly longer than usual. A proposal that sounds good, but something about the timing feels uncertain. A colleague who responds with a tone that's just a little different than before. Nothing obvious, nothing that demands attention. So the mind moves past it. There are already enough things to focus on, and subtle signals rarely look important in the moment. They're quiet. They arrive as small impressions rather than clear information. A feeling that something is slightly off, or slightly better than expected, or slightly early. But because the day is already moving fast, those signals don't stay long enough to be examined. The brain makes a quick decision, not consciously, automatically. It prioritizes what feels immediate, the messages that need responses, the problems that can be solved quickly, the tasks that produce visible progress, and the quieter signals fade into the background. Most people never notice when this shift happens, because everything still feels productive, the work is still getting done, but the brain has already made a small adjustment in how it processes information. It begins favoring speed over detail. Quick interpretation becomes more useful than careful reading. Nuance becomes less important than momentum. Again, nothing dramatic happens. No major mistake appears, but something small begins to change. Situations start feeling slightly harder to read. Conversations require a little more interpretation. Opportunities feel less obvious than they used to. And most people assume the environment simply became more complicated. But in many cases, the environment didn't change very much. What changed was the quality of attention reading it. The brain is still detecting signals, thousands of them. Tone shifts, posture changes, timing differences, small patterns in behavior. But when the system is busy maintaining speed, it stops examining those signals carefully. It compresses them, it simplifies them, and sometimes it ignores them completely. Not because the signals disappeared, but because the system processing them has already moved on to the next task. At first, the difference is almost impossible to notice, but over time, a quiet effect begins to appear. Situations that once felt clear start feeling slightly harder to interpret. And that's usually the first moment when something deeper has already started changing, not in the world around you, but in how your brain is reading it. At some point, the pace of the day changes, not dramatically, just enough to notice that more things require your attention than before. More messages arrive, more meetings appear on the calendar, more decisions seem to need quick responses. None of this feels unusual. In fact, it often looks like progress. More activity usually means things are moving. So the natural response is simple. You increase effort. You respond faster. You review more details. You take more calls. You try to stay ahead of everything. And for a while, this works. Problems get solved. Tasks move forward. The system keeps running. But something subtle begins to appear. The relationship between effort and results starts to change. The same amount of work no longer creates the same clarity. Decisions take longer to feel certain. Situations require more analysis than they used to. And sometimes, the timing of a decision begins to drift slightly. A choice that once felt obvious now feels heavier. Not impossible, just harder to commit to. So you gather more information. You wait a little longer. You review a few more variables before acting. Occasionally that delay changes the outcome. An opportunity shifts. Someone else moves first. A window that was open becomes narrower. Again, nothing dramatic happens. No single event looks like a mistake. From the outside, everything still appears responsible. Careful decisions, thoughtful analysis, more effort than before. But inside the process, something small has already started to change. Timing becomes less precise. Some decisions happen a little later than they should. Others happen slightly sooner than necessary. And the difference between those two moments is often very small. Days, sometimes hours. But small timing differences accumulate. A partnership that could have moved forward now requires more negotiation. An investment opportunity becomes slightly less attractive. A conversation that once felt easy now feels more complicated. None of these outcomes look like failures. They simply feel less responsive, as if the environment stopped reacting as clearly as it once did. So the natural reaction is predictable. Increase effort again, more analysis, more research, more attention to detail, but the added effort doesn't always restore the clarity that used to be there, because the problem isn't the amount of work being applied, it's something quieter, something inside the process that interprets situations before decisions are made. And when that internal signal becomes slightly distorted, the outside world begins to feel harder to read. Most people notice the change in results first. What they rarely see is where the change actually started. By the time results start feeling less responsive, most people assume the problem is external. The market changed. The environment became more competitive. Opportunities became harder to recognize. And sometimes those explanations are true. But often something else changed first, something much quieter. Inside the brain, every decision begins long before the conscious mind explains it. Your nervous system is constantly scanning the environment, tone of voice, facial tension, timing between responses, subtle pauses in conversation, small changes in posture or attention, thousands of signals every second. You don't calculate them. Your brain compresses them into a single internal output, a sense of how a situation feels. Clear, uncertain, promising, off. This process normally happens with remarkable accuracy. Over time, the brain learns patterns. It compares what's happening now to thousands of previous situations and predicts what is likely to happen next. That prediction becomes the signal guiding your decisions, but this system depends on one condition: signal clarity. When the nervous system is calm and regulated, the brain can process subtle information. It notices nuance. It compares more variables. It allows time for patterns to become visible. But when pressure increases, deadlines, financial responsibility, constant responsiveness, the system begins to change priorities. Not consciously, biologically. The brain shifts into a faster operating mode. Speed becomes more valuable than precision. Attention narrows. Instead of analyzing many signals, the brain begins simplifying them. Small differences between situations start getting compressed into broader categories: safe, risky, urgent, ignore. This works extremely well in emergencies. But in environments that depend on timing and judgment, something important gets lost: nuance. The signals guiding decisions become louder but less detailed. And when that happens, two patterns start appearing. Some decisions happen too quickly, just to reduce internal pressure. Others get delayed longer than necessary because the situation feels heavier than it actually is. Both outcomes come from the same place: a nervous system trying to manage load. From the outside, the behavior still looks reasonable: careful analysis, thoughtful caution, occasional urgency. But underneath those behaviors, the signal guiding the decision has already been altered. Not by lack of intelligence, not by lack of information, but by internal noise. And when the signal becomes slightly distorted, something subtle happens to timing. Situations that once felt obvious begin to feel ambiguous. Opportunities become harder to recognize. Conversations require more interpretation. Two people can look at the same situation and reach completely different conclusions, not because one of them understands more, but because one system is reading the signals more clearly. Most people spend years trying to fix this problem by gathering more information, more research, more strategy, more analysis. But the clarity they're looking for doesn't always come from adding more data. Sometimes it appears when something much simpler happens, when the system interpreting the situation becomes quiet again. Something interesting happens when pressure finally slows down, not because everything in life suddenly becomes easier, but because the internal pace begins to change. The same situations that once felt complicated start registering differently. A conversation that would have required careful interpretation now feels straightforward. A decision that previously felt heavy suddenly looks simple. Nothing about the external environment necessarily changed. The same people, the same opportunities, the same risks, but internally something has shifted. The nervous system is no longer operating under constant load. And when that happens, perception changes in a quiet but important way. The brain begins processing more detail again. Subtle signals return to awareness. Tone shifts become easier to notice. Timing differences become clearer. Small behavioral patterns become visible again. Decisions stop feeling urgent. Instead, they start feeling obvious. Not obvious in a dramatic way, just clear enough that the next step makes sense without forcing it. This is the moment many experienced investors, leaders, and negotiators describe when they explain their best decisions. They rarely describe intense analysis. More often, they say something simpler. The situation just became clear. What actually happened is less mysterious. The signal guiding the decision became clean again. When the nervous system is regulated, the brain can hold more variables at once. It can compare patterns more accurately. It can tolerate uncertainty long enough to see how a situation is unfolding. And because urgency is no longer dominating the process, decisions stop being driven by relief. They begin to follow alignment instead. This has quiet consequences over time. Timing improves. Opportunities become easier to recognize before they fully develop. Risk becomes easier to evaluate without rushing toward or away from it. Financial choices become calmer and more deliberate. From the outside, it can look like better strategy. But underneath, something simpler is happening. The system reading the situation has stopped distorting the signal. And when that happens, results begin responding to decisions again. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently, which brings the entire pattern back to where it started. Most people believe their biggest mistakes come from bad information. In reality, they often come from something much quieter. A nervous system that was too overloaded to read the situation clearly.